7. It was too early in the day for tourists to be out on the trails, which was a shame for them, I thought, as I walked. Beads of dew clung to every blade of glass, and I could hear the quiet clicks of the undergrowth as the world stretched itself slowly awake. Sunlight cut through the surrounding trees, and the path was scattered with pine needles, the warm air filled with the sweet smell of the woodland. The area was at its most beautiful first thing. This was the time of day when my father had always gone out walking. He had liked sunrises. He had liked seeing hares flitting across the trail far ahead of him. He told me once that he'd spotted a deer a distance away in the trees, and I remembered smiling at the quiet excitement in his voice, which had seemed such a contrast from the intense man in my memories. Maybe that happens to all of us in time, I'd thought. We slow down a little. We loosen our knots. We learn to find pleasure in the smaller, softer moments. But then he had found something else. As I walked, I turned the obvious questions over in my mind. Who had sent my father that photograph? Who was the murdered woman? And nagging beneath those, a different one. Did whatever my father had done next play some part in his decision to take his own life? I headed north along the trail, moving at a slow pace and scanning the trees and the undergrowth as I went. The route was familiar enough, but I'd always thought of it as peaceful and calming here, and knowing what I did gave it a sense of threat instead. The world was almost silent, and as far as I could tell, I was alone, but there was the sensation of being watched. Despite telling myself it was ridiculous, I found myself listening carefully and keeping an eye on my surroundings, and I made sure to walk in the middle of the path, well away from the edge of the tree line. Walking in my father's shoes, and also trying to put myself into his head. As I'd said to Fleming yesterday, the vast majority of my work involved looking after my patients, men who had already been caught for their crimes, but I had also contributed to 3 active cases. Each time, I had provided a carefully considered profile of the potential offender. Doing so involved research and statistical analysis, not magic or mind reading, but there was also an element of empathy. In some ways, it wasn't so different from my more everyday work. It was a matter of looking at the available facts, trying to work out how someone might be thinking and feeling, and then attempting to see the world through their eyes. I didn't have enough evidence yet to understand why my father had ended up at the Reach, but I had a lifetime of experience to help me understand him in other ways. I pictured him walking slightly behind me now. "Why didn't you go to the police with the photograph?" I asked him, and then I allowed my subconscious to answer me with his voice. "Talk to Liam Fleming?" I imagined him saying. "Have you lost your mind, my son?" I almost smiled, but it would have been the right thing to do, I thought. Maybe. But I always had a complicated relationship with the job. A hesitation. Actually, I probably wouldn't have put it like that, would I? But we both know it's true. Yes, I thought. We do. I mean, I loved it, but it never felt like I made much of a difference. Maybe just in a few small ways, here and there. But there was never a big case, not like in those books I love so much. And by the end, I was pretty much a joke to everyone. That old dinosaur, right? The new guys made fun of me behind my back. Go on, I thought. It was a little life, all in all. And I suppose that when I found her body, a part of me didn't want to be sidelined like I always had been. And it seemed to me that it was my job to take care of her. You know how strongly I felt about things. Yes, I thought. That makes sense to me, Dad. I continued along the trail, my shoes crunching softly on the pine needles strewn across the path, still picturing my father walking patiently behind. "Why didn't you tell me about the body?" He was silent for a moment. Perhaps my subconscious didn't want to provide an answer. My father and I had rarely talked about the work I did with my patients, because he had indeed felt things strongly, and I knew he had struggled to see such people as worthy of empathy or understanding. But even so, he must have known my expertise could have been useful. And yet he had chosen not to talk to me. "Why didn't you tell me, Dad?" Maybe exactly because of what you just thought. I frowned to myself. What does that mean? Because you've done work that matters. You've caught killers. I looked down at the trail, considering that. I always tried to downplay my occasional role in cases. That wasn't out of modesty, but realism. The way I saw it, the police would have got there eventually without my help. And yet the truth was that my work really had helped to catch 3 men that I knew of, and most likely before they had gone on to hurt others. I had talked to my father about that. Perhaps unlike with my work at the prison, I had wanted him to be impressed or proud. But I hadn't stopped to think that they were exactly the kind of cases he had always dreamed of being involved in, and never had been. Maybe I just wanted something on the ledger that was mine. Anyway, we're here. I looked up again. A few meters ahead, I saw the white branch emerging from the tree line, poking down crookedly into the undergrowth at the edge of the path. The surprise was such that I actually turned and checked behind me, but of course the trail was empty. My father wasn't really there. I had just been lost in thought, and my subconscious had noticed where I was a few seconds before my mind actively registered it. I approached the tree. It had been over a month since the woman's body had been found, and no evidence remained of it ever having been here. The foliage by my feet was undisturbed. There were no scorch marks. But then, the news reports I had read indicated that police believed she had been killed somewhere else, and then brought here afterward. Why would someone do that? Without access to an actual case file, it was impossible even to begin to answer that question. When constructing a profile, you always had to be cautious, to stick to the available facts, and remember that the same act could have multiple explanations. Burning the victim might have personal meaning to the killer. It might have been an attempt at hiding her identity, or perhaps it had seemed like the most straightforward method of destroying evidence, or a combination of all three, along with any number of other possible motivations. But the location was curious. Some killers kept their victims' bodies, but the majority of patients I had worked with or studied had either destroyed or disposed of them. The intention was almost always that the body would not be discovered for as long as possible. There were plenty of wilder, less accessible spots on the island that would have been more effective dump sites than this, but the killer had gone to the effort of moving the dead woman, with all the risk that entailed, and then left her where she was certain to be found. Why would he do that? I imagined a different presence standing behind me now. Not my father. A more shadowy and insubstantial figure this time, a man made mostly of smoke for the moment. And while the woods remained quiet, and the early morning sun continued to hang like mist between the trees, the world seemed to darken slightly. I steeled myself. Why did you bring her here? I thought. Silence. What were you trying to say? Silence. But then, I didn't know nearly enough yet to give the killer a voice in the same way I had with my father. I shook my head, then reached into my jacket and took out the photograph. Using the distinctive branch as a guide, I moved myself closer to the exact place in which my father had been standing. 1 foot here, the other there. Then I turned, angling my body so I was facing in the direction he had been when the photograph was taken, and then held my breath. The woods around the trails were dense, but there was a slight break in the tree line ahead of me now. In the distance, the land rose steeply, and distant crags, bare outcrops of rock, overlooked the spot where I was standing. Not impossible to reach, but a long way off the path. I looked down at the photograph. I could still sense that shadowy, voiceless presence behind me, but I didn't ask it anything. For the moment, I didn't need to. Why had he brought her here? Perhaps so that he could watch when she was found. I marked the crag as best I could on the GPS map on my phone and then set off through the undergrowth. There was no clear path, and within a few minutes I was fighting through the foliage, snapping off branches and pushing through tangled grass, sticks cracking beneath my feet. My destination was soon out of sight, but the phone kept me more or less on track, heading in the right direction and pushing my way slowly uphill through the forest. What exactly was I doing? That was a perfectly reasonable question, but one to which I had no immediate answer. The chances of finding anything out here after all this time were remote. But while I knew the woods around the crime scene would have been searched, the crag was far enough away that it would probably have escaped attention. And it was the most likely vantage point from which to take the photograph. Eventually there was a break in the trees and the land opened up ahead. Pale stone stretched sharply upward, with a rough path in the rock that was dotted with shivery patches of grass and scrub. I started to climb carefully, using roots in the rock as handholds. The rough shingle was loose beneath my feet, and the breeze grew colder and stronger with every cautious step. Would my father have been able to climb up here? I thought so. He was old but active, a long way from being infirm, and as I knew very well, he had been nothing if not determined. Assuming he hadn't gone to the police, I was sure he would have followed the evidence in the photograph at least this far, and on a less rational level, I felt a connection with him as I climbed. The strange sensation of him being right here with me, just at a different time. I was drenched with sweat as I approached the top, despite the wind, and the woods seemed dizzyingly far below me. I clambered up and round onto a wide ledge of rock that stretched out several meters ahead. Then I stood still for a few seconds, catching my breath. My heart was beating hard. Here you are, I thought. A short distance ahead, tucked away out of sight of the edge of the outcrop, were the remains of a campsite. There was an old tent, the thin red fabric tattered and ripped and flapping in the wind. It was held in place by tight, spidery ropes attached to nails hammered into the stone. I dusted my hands against my thighs and made my way across. Closer to, the sound of the tent's torn material made a frantic cracking sound, like a bird tethered to something trying to escape. I crouched down and peered into the entrance. It was small inside, and I could see the rock pushing up sharply through the taut canvas. If someone had slept overnight in here, they must have been hardy and used to the elements. Whoever that was had left something behind. After a moment's hesitation, I reached inside and picked up the single item inside the tent. It was a brown leather wallet, worn from being carried for years. It felt light and baggy in my hand, as though it had been full once but had been emptied out before being placed in the tent. And placed was exactly the right word, I thought, because there was nothing else inside, and I didn't believe that this had been left behind by accident. None of this felt like an accident. I flipped the wallet open. It wasn't entirely empty. There was a driver's license inside, and a small photo of a man stared out at me from the left-hand side. On the right, there was a name, Darren Field, and an address. I stared at it for a moment, committing the details to memory, then put the license back into the wallet and placed it back where I had found it. Assuming my father had come here, he had clearly decided to leave it, and so for the moment, following in his footsteps, I would too. Then I stood up and walked as close to the edge of the crag as I dared. The fabric of the tent was still cracking desolately behind me, and the woods stretched away below. I took out my phone and turned on the camera, angling it down, trying to keep my aim steady as I zoomed in as far as I could. The foliage on the screen was shaky and blurry, but after a few seconds, I was able to locate the spot in which my father had been standing when the photograph was taken. The angle was exact. I lowered my phone, and then I imagined that silent presence behind me again. "What kind of man are you?" I thought. No answer. "You brought the body of a woman out here to the woods," I thought. "You took a photograph of the moment she was found. And then you sent it to the person who did so, knowing full well that it would lead them to the scene you left behind. Why would you do that?" Once again, the figure behind me said nothing, but then I heard a man's voice, raised finally from my subconscious, but still so quiet for the moment that it was barely louder than a whisper. "Isn't it obvious?" he said. And then a sigh, almost lost to the wind. "I did it because I wanted to be seen. James, February 1998. Look at this," his mother says. We made it. James glances up expectantly. He is 11 years old and has never been to the seaside before. He's seen it on television and in brochures, though, and for the last few weeks the images have been locked in his head, waiting to become real. Warm yellow sunshine, blue skies and seas, everyone smiling and happy. He's been so giddy that he's found it hard to sleep. But as his mother takes the turnoff for the campsite now, it's nothing like how he imagined. He leans down to peer out, and his heart sinks a little. It's not very different at all. The sky through the windscreen ahead is gray and empty, the same one he sees every day out of his little bedroom window in the tower block, and there's no sign of the sea. There's just grass shivering in the cold wind on the ridges of moorland around them. It could be anywhere. "Hey," Barnaby tells him, "you're strong. You're brave." James strokes the head of the soft toy lion in his lap. Barnaby is his best friend. James has had him for as long as he can remember. He had an argument with his mother last year because the other children at school were beginning to make fun of him for taking Barnaby into lessons, and his mother wanted him to stop. "I'll look after him at home. He'll be fine, I promise." She'd been pretty full on about it, but when he finally managed to get it through to her how much Barnaby helped him, she had eventually sighed and looked sad, and then she hadn't mentioned it again. They pull up on an expanse of gravel at the side of the road. James looks around. The car park is bedraggled and empty. But that makes sense, right? His mother has told him, over and over, that this is an odd time of year to come on holiday, but that it means the place will be cheap, and they'll have it all to themselves. It had sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as him, and he can tell that she's still trying to do that now, staring out at this windswept, barren place. She says something now. He doesn't quite catch it. "Mom?" he asks. A dot of rain lands on the windscreen. "I said I'm sorry, James. I know it doesn't look that good." He looks at her for a moment, feeling helpless. It's bad when she's angry at him, but that doesn't happen often, and it doesn't matter because he knows it won't last. It's always so much worse when she's like this, angry at herself. Because she doesn't deserve to be. "You know what to do," Barnaby tells him. "It looks great, Mom." He remembers what she's told him. "We'll make the best of it. There are some nice walks around here. And you borrowed a little gas burner so we can cook dinner together out in the open tonight. And the sleeping bags are warmer than they look. We'll have fun." She stares back at him for a moment. He waits. Then she ruffles his hair. "You and me against the world, James," she says quietly. "Right?" "Yes." He's so pleased. Always. They get out of the car and his mother opens the trunk. They begin to collect their gear, and James looks around the car park again. It's empty to all intents and purposes, but actually, not quite. He pauses for a moment, his fingers on the back of the car. There's an old camper van tucked away out of sight in one corner, dark and dirty. The branches of the trees above are overgrown and hanging down over it. The vehicle looks abandoned, as though it has been sitting there for years, but there's something about it that bothers him. He stares at the pitch-black windows of the cab. It's empty, or it looks it, but James. He flinches suddenly, then moves his hands away quickly, just as the lid of the boot slams down. The sound echoes around the car park. His mother stares at him. "Just pay attention," she says. "Please?" He's not sure if she's talking to him or herself, but he nods anyway. Then he collects his share of the bags at the back of the car and follows his mother over the ridge ahead of them. And while he can still feel that old camper van behind him, he doesn't look back. James helps his mother pitch the tent, or at least he tries to. The whole thing is baffling and impossible. He struggles to click the sticks into place and then bend them through the loops on the thin fabric. The frustration becomes almost overwhelming, and he bites his lip in concentration. Everything starts shaking. The tent, the sticks, his hands. Then the end flicks away upward, and he falls back on his. "I said I'm sorry, James. I know it doesn't look that good." He looks at her for a moment, feeling helpless. It's bad when she's angry at him, but that doesn't happen often, and it doesn't matter because he knows it won't last. It's always so much worse when she's like this, angry at herself, because she doesn't deserve to be. "You know what to do," Barnaby tells him. "It looks great, Mom." He remembers what she's told him. "We'll make the best of it. There are some nice walks around here. and you borrowed a little gas burner so we can cook dinner together out in the open tonight, and the sleeping bags are warmer than they look. We'll have fun." She stares back at him for a moment. He waits. Then she ruffles his hair. "You and me against the world, James," she says quietly. "Right? Yes?" He's so pleased. "Always?" They get out of the car and his mother opens the trunk. They begin to collect their gear, and James looks around the car park again. It's empty to all intents and purposes, but actually, not quite. He pauses for a moment, his fingers on the back of the car. There's an old camper van tucked away out of sight in one corner, dark and dirty. The branches of the trees above it are overgrown and hanging down over it. The vehicle looks abandoned, as though it has been sitting there for years, but there's something about it that bothers him. He stares at the pitch-black windows of the cab. It's empty, or it looks it, but James. He flinches suddenly, then moves his hands away quickly just as the lid of the boot slams down. The sound echoes around the car park. His mother stares at him. "Just pay attention," she says. "Please?" He's not sure if she's talking to him or herself, but he nods anyway. Then he collects his share of the bags at the back of the car and follows his mother over the ridge ahead of them. And while he can still feel that old camper van behind him, he doesn't look back. James helps his mother pitch the tent, or at least he tries to. The whole thing is baffling and impossible. He struggles to click the sticks into place and then bend them through the loops on the thin fabric. The frustration becomes almost overwhelming, and he bites his lip in concentration. Everything starts shaking. The tent, the sticks, his hands. Then the end flicks away upward, and he falls back on his heels. "It doesn't want to be built," he says. His mother is struggling too, and seems to be about to lose her temper. "Don't do this, James." "I wish Dad was here." That's the anger talking. There's probably nothing he could have said that would hurt his mother more. The stupid thing is that he isn't even sure if it's true. It's been such a long time since James has seen his father that he can't even really remember what he looks like. It's more like he's an absence that would be comforting to fill. But he knows that's not how his mother feels. James wrote a letter to his father just before Christmas, talking about life and how he wished they were all still together. He even drew him a picture. But when he gave it to his mother, she tried to argue. So he got upset with her, and just as with Barnaby, she'd eventually sighed and looked sad and promised to send it. But he isn't sure if she did. She takes a few deep breaths now, and then puts her hand on his arm. "I'm trying," she says. "I'm sorry." "You don't need to be. Just work with me, okay?" There is a look of resolve on her face, a determination to make the best of it, despite the shabbiness and smallness of it all. "Okay," he says. When they finish building the tent, it looks barely sufficient to protect them from the elements, but James feels happy with it. "Are you proud of me?" he thinks. That's all he ever wants, but as usual, he doesn't dare to ask the question. What if she doesn't reply? Because he's let go of the anger from earlier, but he's not sure his mother has. Emotions come and go quickly for him, but he knows that grown-ups hold on to them for much longer, and his mother more than most. So he just thinks the question instead, concentrating on it so hard that it seems impossible she won't be able to read his mind. "Are you proud of me?" "I'll just get some things from the car," she says. "I'll come with you." "I just need a minute to myself, James." He hesitates. "Okay." And then he waits by the tent, hoping that she'll be better when she gets back. The seconds tick by. She returns a few minutes later with a bag of their belongings, a blanket and towel, a frisbee. And he's relieved to see that her mood is settled and she looks a little brighter. "All right then," she says. "Let's go and find the sea." It's a longer walk than he's expecting, down a trail lined with more of that shivering grass. There are signposts warning that it's not safe to swim here because of the currents, which doesn't matter to him. Learning to swim is, but he can't. And then it's like time begins to blur. As the man approaches him, and the whistling grows louder, James sees his mother waking up an hour from now. She is groggy at first, because it always takes her a little time to come around, but her first proper thought will be of him. Because he knows that she loves him, she'll sit up carefully and call his name. When he doesn't shout back, she'll feel a small curl of panic against her heart, but she won't be properly worried, not at first. He'll be at the tent, she'll think. Everything will be fine, because of course it will be. And the whistling stops. Nobody sees, the man says. He ruffles James's hair with a rough, dirty hand. And nobody cares. Part 2. Anger. I'm sorry about your dad. 2 hours later, I was standing in the car park at the Reach with Craig Aspinall, the man who had spoken with my father here, and who had then noticed his car was still here the next day. Aspinall was in his 70s, his complexion weathered by a lifetime spent out in the elements. There was a watery gleam to his eyes as he spoke. He was trying to keep himself together on the surface, but the emotion he was feeling was clearly visible underneath. "Thank you," I said. "I'm sorry too. I just keep thinking." But then he trailed off and shook his head. He took a sip of coffee from the lid of the thermos flask he was carrying. There was no need for him to finish. It was easy for me to imagine what must be going through his head. Some variation of what if. What if he had done things differently that day? What if he had paid a little more attention and noticed that something was wrong? It was an almost ubiquitous reaction to trauma, and right now he was wearing the guilt as plainly as the wax jacket he was pulling around himself against the cold. "I understand," I said, "but it's important to remember that my father chose to do what he did. It wasn't your fault. It feels like I should have realized." "Perhaps," I said, "but however you or I might feel about it, it was his decision, and there's another way of looking at it too. You knew him, right?" "Yeah." He nodded. "Pretty well. So you know the kind of man he was. Stubborn as hell." "Exactly," I said. "Which means that it wouldn't have mattered what you said or did, because once he'd made his mind up about something, there wouldn't have been any changing it." "Yeah, maybe." He hesitated. "Do you have any idea why?" "No," I said quickly. "I don't." Which remained true, but the question had taken on additional nuance since Fleming had asked me it yesterday. I glanced at the footpath that led away from the car park toward the Reach itself. I knew a little more about my father now. I knew he had been keeping a secret, but whether that had played into whatever happened here remained a secret in itself. "How was my father when you saw him?" I said. "Pretty much the same as always. Did it seem to you like he was troubled by anything?" "I don't know," Aspinall frowned. "When I look back on it, all I keep thinking is that it seemed like he wanted rid of me, like I was interrupting something or holding him back. But maybe that's just me overthinking things because of what happened." "Maybe," I said. I glanced over at my father's car, which was the only vehicle parked here right now. Aspinall was a walker. Like me, he had arrived here on foot. He followed my gaze and took it as a prompt. "Ah, God, sorry. You'll be wanting these." He got the keys out of his pocket and passed them to me. "There's no need to apologize," I said. "But yes, I do. Thank you." I locked it for safekeeping. I'm sure it would have been okay, but you get kids up here messing around sometimes. I remember. I unlocked my father's car and eased myself into the driver's seat. Out of habit, I started to place my hands on the steering wheel, tended to my son, but that conjured up a memory of him attempting to teach me to drive, and I released my grip. Our growing frustration and impatience with each other back then had quickly put a stop to those lessons. Pay attention. Was that his voice or mine? I glanced around the car. My father had driven to his death in this vehicle, and yet it was as clean and well-maintained as the house. There were no signs of disarray, nothing that suggested a distressed state of mind, nothing that Aspinall tapped on the window. I wound it down. "Look." There was an awkward expression on his face. I'm not sure if this is the right thing to tell you or not, but if I don't, then it'll just bother me until I do. And I don't know when I'll get the chance again. Then you should do it now, I said. When your father and I were speaking, well, I asked about you. Just casual conversation, you know? The way you do. And he said you were doing great. Did he? Yeah. Aspinall paused. He said he was very proud of you. Well, I said, it's a shame you didn't tell me that, isn't it? Aspinall blinked quick-eyed. I'm sorry, Dr. Garvey. It's fine. It's just. Aspinall trailed off, looking sad and wounded. It's just what a father would want their son to know. Thank you. And I was about to close the window, but he was still hovering there, unwilling for some reason to end our encounter. What are your plans? He said. I'm sticking around for a while. That's the thing about this island, right? A note of bitterness entered his expression. You think you've got away, but the place keeps dragging you back. No, I said, just until things are sorted. He nodded to himself, as though that was what everyone said. So what are you going to do now? I looked out through the windscreen. What was I going to do? I had been turning that question over in my mind ever since finding the makeshift campsite up on the crag. It would have been possible for me to overlook the photograph, or fail to understand its significance, but it was much harder to ignore what it had led me to. My father had decided not to go to the police, and so far I had respected his wishes, but whatever duty I still felt to him, others were beginning to press on me now. And yet perhaps there were still a few of his footsteps I could follow in first. I put my hands back on the steering wheel, thinking about the name Darren Field and the address I'd read on the driving license that had been left so conspicuously in the tent, like a breadcrumb on a trail. I think I might go for a drive, I said. I arrived at the terminal in time to catch the midday ferry. After parking in the hold, I stood out on the passenger deck above, watching the empty sea ahead as I left the island behind. After my previous visits here, it had always been a relief to do so. But this time, I knew I would be returning later, and any prospect of escape was tempered by the thought of what I might discover in the hours ahead. I suppressed the anger that had surprised me back at the reach, and imagined my father standing behind me. Did you make this journey, Dad? I thought. He offered no response to that. Any reply he gave could only come from my own subconscious, and that wasn't a question I was capable of answering. Time would tell. One thing I was sure of was that, if he had done, he would have been standing out where I was right now. Whenever we journeyed off the island together, he insisted on doing so, even when the weather was bad and I tried to persuade him to sit inside where it was warm. What? I imagined him saying now. And miss this view? I smiled. Plus it's bracing, right? I said quietly. That's right. He sounded pleased that I remembered. Keeps the senses sharp, my son. When the ferry reached the mainland, I returned to the car and joined the steady stream of vehicles rolling slowly down the ramp. Within a few minutes, I was away from the terminal and driving along country roads. I had Darren Field's address programmed into my GPS. The town I was heading to was about an hour's drive away. I turned the radio on. I didn't recognize the name of the station my father had it set to, but it turned out to be the kind of gentle conversation that was exactly what I needed right then. As I drove, I listened to people talking about nothing, allowing their voices to wash over me, until it was almost a surprise when I realized I had arrived at my destination. The address was in a nice neighborhood. Detached houses curled around horseshoe-shaped streets, with trees spaced out neatly along the grass verges. I parked and looked out the window. Field's house was as well maintained as the ones around it, but it seemed to have a melancholy air, as though someone had stopped taking care of it, but too recently for the cracks to have begun to show. I tapped the steering wheel, doubting myself now. What was I hoping to achieve by coming here? The idea that it might be dangerous to do so had been lingering at the back of my mind throughout the journey. The worst-case scenario, I supposed, was that I was parked outside the home of a manipulative killer, but that didn't make sense to me. In my experience, murderers did not tend to leave clues that led directly to their front door. If there was a link between this address and the body my father had found in the woods, I was sure the connection would be more oblique than that. But it was hard to imagine what it might be. There's only one way to find out. My father's voice from the seat behind me. "What did you do now?" I thought. "What do you imagine I did?" "Don't overthink things. Just go and knock on the front door and see what happens." I nodded to myself. After locking the car, I made my way up the drive, but my arrival must have already been noted, because the front door opened before I reached it. Only a little, though. Whoever was inside had kept it on the chain. As I drew closer, I saw a woman there, standing back from the slightly open gap. She looked suspicious, nervous even. "Can you stay back, please?" she said. "Of course." I stopped a short distance from the door and smiled lightly. She was maybe a few years older than I was, but it was hard to be more precise, as both her pale skin and the shadows beneath her eyes suggested she wasn't sleeping well or taking care of herself. There was a restlessness to her, too. Her body was moving slightly, as though there was some energy inside her that wouldn't allow her to keep still. "I'm sorry," I said. "Is this a bad time?" She considered that. "It is a bad time," she said. "Yes. I'm sorry to bother you then. I was hoping to speak to Darren Field. He's not here." "Okay. Yeah," she said. "That's kind of why it's a bad time." I was about to reply, but then the woman glanced over my shoulder, and the look of suspicion on her face deepened. "Wait a minute. Is that your car?" "Yes," I said. "Sort of." She pointed at it. "I'm sure of it." "The man?" "The weird old man who came to talk to Darren." I didn't think my father would have appreciated that description much, but at least it cleared up one question. He had followed the trail this far. At the same time, it raised others. Presumably, he had come here looking for Darren Field, and now Field wasn't here, and from the woman's demeanor there was clearly something very wrong about that. "It's my father's car," I said. "Was his car, I mean. He died a few days ago." She didn't seem in the mood to offer condolences. "Why did he want to speak to Darren? Why do you come to that?" "I found Darren's name and address in my father's files," I said. "I don't actually know who Darren is. I'd never heard of him before. And I don't know why my father came to see him. I suppose the reason I'm here is that I'm looking for answers myself." "When was this?" "A couple of weeks ago. The day before Darren left." "Darren's your husband, right?" "Your guess is as good as mine." She held up her hand, showing her wedding ring. "I don't know if he's still wearing his. All I know is that your father, if that's who it was, came to see him, and then everything went to shit. The day after that, Darren was gone. I haven't seen him since." The information sent a ripple of alarm through me. My father had a strong sense of justice, but he was also an impulsive man who struggled with his temper. Given the reason for his visit here, I hoped he hadn't done something stupid. The idea seemed ridiculous, and I tried to tell myself that. Except it was clear that he had kept this investigation to himself, and equally obvious that I had no real idea what had been going through his head these past few weeks. Perhaps the answer to why he had taken his life was that he'd snapped and done something his conscience wouldn't allow him to live with. But I didn't want to believe that. "So you don't know where Darren is now?" I said. "Probably with her, whoever she is." "What do you mean? You got a sister?" I shook my head. "No." I just wondered. The two of them went off into another room to talk, and I couldn't hear any of that. "But your father said something about an island, and that he wanted to talk to Darren about a woman. He was too old to be someone's angry husband, so I thought that maybe Darren might have been messing around with his daughter." I didn't reply. The island. The woman. I knew exactly who my father had been referring to, but of course there was no way I could explain that to Darren Field's wife. A moment later she mistook my silence for awkwardness. "It's fine, by the way," she said. I don't give a shit about that. I've got used to it over the years. Don't ask, don't tell. A part of me always knew what I was getting into when I got involved with him, but I never thought the bastard would actually leave me. Although I should be glad he's gone, shouldn't I? Strike that, actually. I am glad he's gone. She was too hurt for that to be true. Did my father seem angry? I said. Not really. The two of them were both very serious, though. When they came out of the room, they both seemed kind of grim. Darren wouldn't tell me about it. No surprises there. We hadn't been talking much anyway. He was a bit shaken about something, though, and I was worried about him. She laughed without humor. What a fucking idiot, right? He was just building up to making his decision. I see that now. I'm sorry. People come up with explanations based on the facts they have, and, in terms of Darren Field's disappearance, it was clear to me why his wife had settled on the one she had. But she didn't have access to the same facts that I did. My father had come here to talk to Field about a murdered woman, and then Field had vanished. If my father hadn't seemed angry, then that was something to cling to, at least. And Field had not left with him that day, which was probably something else. But the feeling of alarm had not lifted. I'm sorry, I said again. Don't be. She shook her head. I already told you, I'm glad he's gone. Well then, I'm sorry to have bothered you. I turned away. But you'll tell me if you hear from him, she said quickly. I mean, you might write, because if your father knew him, he might get in touch, about the funeral or whatever. I looked back. The suspicion on her face had been replaced by quiet desperation now, and her fingers were clutching the edge of the door. I felt slightly sick inside. She needed reassurance I was in no position to give, and she was asking me to make a promise that I might not be able to keep. And yet it seemed unfair to leave her with nothing. I'll try.